Thank you for joining me for this presentation in the 2008 study, Comprehension of Grammatical and Emotional Prosody is Impaired in Alzheimer's Disease by Vanessa Taylor and colleagues. Before we begin, when an asterisk appears on screen, detail and extended text on the topic appears in the supplemental information. You can find citations both at the end of the supplemental information as well as at the end of the slides. There may be times in this video when you'll want to pause playback. Feel free to do this at any time, and this pause symbol will appear on screen when it's most appropriate. Today we'll discuss the authors and their backgrounds, review some important terms when discussing this study. We'll discuss the background and introduce the study itself, looking specifically at the abstract and issues and questions addressed. We'll discuss the study's methodology and its findings, and then discussion and conclusions. I'll provide a brief and humble critique, followed by a brief discussion of an unrelated study. Let's begin with the study's authors. The study's authors are Vanessa Taylor, Sherry Baum, Howard Chertko, and Daniel Sommier. At the time of publication, all were faculty at the Center for Research on Language, Mind, and Brain at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Additionally, Dr. Taylor worked at the Bloomfield Center for Research in Aging. Dr. Baum served at the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Dr. Chertko also served at the Bloomfield Center for Research in Aging and the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery, where he worked with Dr. Sommier. Now that we've seen who wrote the study, let's go over some specific terms relevant to it. One cannot understate the debilitating nature of Alzheimer's disease, a chronic neurodegenerative disease responsible for 60 to 70% of dementia cases. Early symptoms often present as short-term memory loss, which is common enough among us all, and not out of the ordinary for the elderly. By degrees, patients experience worsening memory loss, disorientation, mood swings, and problems with language, behavior, and self-care. Over a course of years, long-term memory, speech, and bodily functions are gradually lost, requiring full-time patient care. Caregivers and family members helplessly watch their once vibrant loved one mentally and physically waste away until all that remains is a shell of who they once were. After a life expectancy of 3 to 9 years, Alzheimer's patients usually die from external factors such as bed sores or pneumonia. More than 6 million people live with Alzheimer's in Canada and the U.S. Prosody, in this sense, refers to elements of speech that are not individual phonetic segments, but are patterns of tone, emphasis, and patterns of pitch used by a speaker to convey additional meaning or emotion. This study examines two facets of prosody. Grammatical prosody includes tone, word stress, and rhythm to help the listener parse speech by providing cues to syntax, structure, grammatical boundaries, and sentence type. For example, have you ever noticed how English speakers raise their pitch at the end of a question? That's an example of grammatical prosody. It can provide auditory cues represented by punctuation in writing. Emotional prosody can be expressed in the term tone of voice. We use emphasis, tone, pauses, pitch, and other vocal cues to overlay words with additional meaning. For example, the sentence, "Will you please pick up the children?" has a different meaning than a sentence, "Will you please pick up the children?" The first is a simple question. The second is both a question and a critique. The difference between please and please is lexical stress, and the ability to understand when word emphasis affects meaning is lexical stress perception. Grammatical modality is the expressed stance or attitude of a speaker. Two preliminary tests used in this study include the MMSE, or the Mini Mental State Examination, which is a brief screening to test the mental function of elderly subjects, and the Wechsler Memory Scale. At its third iteration at the time the study was published, is a neuropsychological test to measure memory function in adults. Now let's examine what led the authors to conduct this study. Prosody, such as alterations in pitch, rhythm, and loudness, conveys a great deal of information in spoken language. Problems perceiving or producing prosody confound patients, loved ones, and caregivers, complicating and contributing to the horror of facing Alzheimer's. Citing several previous studies, the authors stated strong evidence indicated problems with language skills co-occurred with memory problems in Alzheimer's patients. One question little explored was if Alzheimer's patients had difficulty with grammatical prosody, like the difference in pitch between questions and statements. Additionally, virtually no studies explored the broad range of prosodic domains to determine which aspects of prosodic comprehension were specifically impacted by the disease. The authors summarized their goals and results in the study's abstract. The full abstract is available in the supplemental information, but to summarize, previous research shows impairment of Alzheimer's patients comprehending emotional prosody. This study explored prosodic processing impairment in order to extend knowledge of grammatical and emotional prosody processing. As expected, Alzheimer's patients showed impairment in comprehending emotional prosody. They also demonstrated difficulty detecting sentence modality, suggesting affective processing impairment at the sentence level. Finally, since the participants in the study were at a mild stage of Alzheimer's, the study suggests prosody impairments occur early in the disease course. So, what specific questions did Taylor and colleagues wish to address? The authors sought to characterize prosodic comprehension skills through detailed, domain-specific prosodic tests. They also wanted to examine lexical stress perception, detection of grammatical modality, and sensitivity to prosodic boundaries heard in phrases. In this fairly small initial study, the authors also wanted to assess the feasibility of administering these tests while identifying specific prosodic domains where evidence suggests impairment. Finally, they wanted to compare their results with the results from the mini mental state examination and the Wechsler memory scale. Now let's look at how they conducted the study and what they found. The authors recruited 10 patients diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's and 10 healthy participants as a control group. Both groups were comparable in terms of age and education, and all were recruited in Montreal, Canada. Significant differences did exist between the two groups' MMSE and Wechsler memory scale results, which could be expected in Alzheimer's patients. Each test took place in the participant's home during a 2-hour session. If participants reported fatigue, testing took place over 2 sessions about a week apart, which was necessary for 1 control and for 8 Alzheimer's participants. The authors digitally recorded the audio stimuli for the tests. These recordings were played for participants on computer speakers, and participants could ask for replay as many times as necessary. Participants were asked to perform 7 different randomized tasks. Each task consisted of several questions. Now let's go through each task and try sample questions where possible. In Task 1, the author started with 3 different types of recorded sentences that demonstrated grammatical modality, or attitude of the speaker. One sentence group was pronounced in English. The second group was English, but then electronically filtered until the words were unclear and only the intonation remained. The third group were nonsense words, spoken with tone and emotion. Participants had to identify whether a speaker was angry, happy, or sad. For demonstration, let's play a sample recording in plain English. Listen to the following and determine if the speaker was angry, happy, or sad.
I wish we could make it home this Christmas.
Here it is again.
I wish we could make it home this Christmas.
That should have been pretty easy, and we can all agree the speaker was sad. What follows now is a low-pass filter recording. The words will not make any sense, but listen closely to the tone and pitch of the following sentence.
For the millionth time, put your cups in the dishwasher.
Here it is one more time.
For the millionth time, put your cups in the dishwasher.
Was the speaker angry, happy, or sad? As you heard, the low-pass filtered recordings were harder to identify. Hopefully you identified that speaker as angry. Across the board, all participants had the least difficulty identifying grammatical modality of sentences in plain English. Many participants had difficulty identifying the nonsense English sentences, and everyone had the most difficulty with the low-pass filtered sentences. With the exception of angry sentences spoken in English, the Alzheimer's patients scored lower than their control counterparts. Task 2 asked participants to differentiate between compound words and similar adjective-noun pairs, for example, greenhouse versus greenhouse. For each question in the task, participants looked at 3 pictures, one of the compound word, one of the adjective-noun pair, and a third unrelated foil. Participants had to match the picture with its stimulus. For example, which of these is a grasshopper? And another example, which of these is a ponytail? Hopefully you chose the hairstyle ponytail. The study authors noted that all participants seemed to have difficulty with this task, averaging only 69%. They noted the differences of control versus Alzheimer participants were not greatly significant, though the Alzheimer's group did score slightly lower than the control. Task 3 asked participants to identify grammatical modality, specifically looking at whether the sentence they heard was a question or a statement. Participants heard 12 pairs of sentences, such as, "He speaks French" and "He speaks French?" Listen to the following recording.
She got a B on that test?
Here it is again.
She got a B on that test?
Was that a question or a statement? That was a question. Here's another example.
All right, gang, dinner's ready.
And one more time.
All right, gang, dinner's ready.
Was that a question or a statement? The second example was a statement. All participants did well identifying statements, but Alzheimer's patients had great difficulty correctly perceiving when tone and inflection made the stimulus a question. Task 4 was identical to Task 1 in that participants listened to English filtered and nonsense recordings. But this time, instead of identifying whether a sentence was happy, angry, or sad, they had to identify the sentence as a statement, a command, or a question, based on the tone and pitch of the speaker. Here's a sample recording.
Does anyone know where my keys are?
Here it is again.
Does anyone know where my keys are?
Was that a statement, a command, or a question? Clearly that was a question. Here's a second example.
Okay, I'll pick you up at 4.
And here it is one more time.
Okay, I'll pick you up at 4.
Statement, command, or question? That one, of course, was a statement. Of the filtered, nonsense, and English sentences, on average, Alzheimer's patients scored lower than their control counterparts. Though one outlying result proved interesting, it seems that Alzheimer's patients correctly identified nonsense statements better than their control counterparts. But take this result with a grain of salt. Alzheimer's patients may not have understood the task, or, as the authors point out, they may have had a bias toward answering statement, which means while their answers were correct, they didn't necessarily identify the stimulus correctly. For Task 5, the authors recorded a natural declarative statement such as, "He wants to leave now," and electronically adjusted the pitch to make it sound like the question, "He wants to leave now?" They created 10 versions of the recording, adjusting the pitch by 11% each time, so the stimulus had a wide range from statement to question, with recordings in the mid-range harder to identify. They also modified a question to sound like a statement, creating 10 versions of adjusted pitch. Participants listened to all 20 stimuli and had to identify whether they heard a question or a statement. There are no samples of this task, and we'll talk more about why later in the presentation. Just about everyone seemed able to correctly identify recordings that were clearly statements, and the mid-range transitioning sentences fell about where one would expect. But Alzheimer's patients seemed to have a more difficult time identifying stimuli that were clearly questions. The authors even said 3 Alzheimer's patients never made the transition from statement to question. In Task 6, the study looked at phrasal boundaries. Using the phrase pink and black and green, the authors inserted incremental pauses after either pink or black, making either pink and black and green or pink and black and green. They also tried lengthening the duration of the word before the boundary. By adjusting the length of the pause or the duration of the keyword, the authors made 50 versions, and the participants had to indicate which they heard. Here's an unaltered sample.
Pink and black and green.
Here's an example with an extended keyword.
Pink and black and green.
and this is an example with a pause inserted.
Pink and black and green.
Let's play that one again.
Pink and black and green.
Which version did you hear? Most listeners would have chosen this answer. For this task, the authors evaluated the pause duration and the keyword duration separately. Although participants tended to favor pink and black and green, in general, the authors said no significant group effects or interactions emerged from either analysis. Task 7 also looked at phrasal boundaries. The authors inserted pauses into 14 sentences, changing their meaning. For example, by manipulating pauses, the authors changed Paul, my friend is handsome, to Paul, my friend is handsome. After hearing each sentence, participants answered comprehension questions to verify how what they heard was parsed. For example, listen to the following recording.
If I dance with anyone else, Bob, my boyfriend will get jealous.
Here it is again.
If I dance with anyone else, Bob, my boyfriend will get jealous.
Now, based on what you heard, would you say that Bob is the speaker's boyfriend, or did Bob ask her to dance? In that sample, Bob asked the speaker to dance. If Bob were the boyfriend, a pause would have come after boyfriend, like this.
If I dance with anyone else, Bob, my boyfriend, will get jealous.
The results of Task 7 revealed no significant differences in the control and Alzheimer's groups. Finally, the authors compared their task results with the Mini Mental State Exam and the Wechsler Memory Scale results, but saw no direct correlation. While they could not directly tie the test results together, the comparison raised one interesting suggestion which we'll look at in a moment. Now we've looked at the tasks and how participants fared. What conclusions did the authors draw from this data? Overall, Alzheimer's patients showed impairment at perceiving effective tone and grammatical modality. That is, they had difficulty picking up the attitude of the speaker through tone, pitch, and other auditory cues the rest of us perceive automatically. Information related to syntactic structure and lexical stress appeared to be unimpaired. That is, when pauses and emphasis helped give context, these early onset Alzheimer's patients appeared relatively spared. Alzheimer's patients had more difficulty perceiving attitude in the filtered and nonsense recordings than they did with English recordings. The authors suggest that these patients could still take advantage of context and clues elsewhere in speech to perceive modality. The authors found across-the-board difficulty in perceiving happy sentences interesting. Previous studies found similar difficulty in healthy older adults identifying happy stimuli, and the authors of this study said this dissociation merited exploration. That Alzheimer's patients had trouble perceiving emotion and attitude, but less problems with other tasks, suggested that Alzheimer's disease may affect emotional prosody independently of other cognitive and perceptual deficits. They pointed to comparable control and Alzheimer's MMSE and Wechsler's test results to suggest the prosody impairment may be unrelated to memory and called for additional studies on this topic with larger participant groups. That prosody impairment appeared independently of cognitive function reinforced the author's theory that loss of prosody perception happens early in Alzheimer's and then remains stable as other cognitive functions decline. They remained cautious about this assertion, however, pointing out the small size of the study and that any number of variables could skew the data. For example, what if the Alzheimer's patients simply didn't understand a particular task? In the end, the authors assert their study suggests impairments in grammatical and emotional prosody in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and they called for larger, more specific, and later disease stage studies. Prosody plays a crucial role in communication, and better understanding prosody impairment could help us better understand Alzheimer's and perhaps alleviate suffering for these patients and the people who care for them. This study hits home for me. This is my father, Ken Piper. In late 2017, on top of bladder cancer and other health problems, he received his Alzheimer's diagnosis. As a family, I can't say we were surprised. For some time, he'd been increasingly forgetful. In conversation, he'd often ask the same question several times. He's moody. He'd often lose things and forget what he was doing. And while science cannot definitively say Alzheimer's is hereditary, family history is a strong risk factor. My father's father suffered from severe dementia throughout the final years of his life. I can't help but wonder if someday this may be my own fate. I laud the authors and their work, dedication, and adherence to scientific principles. Their findings make fairly strong assertions with pointed specificity about grammatical and emotional prosody in early-onset Alzheimer's. Some points that deserve better scrutiny do stand out to me, however. First, while one goal was to determine the feasibility of conducting a similar study on a larger scale, testing a mere 10 Alzheimer's patients from one community seems paltry, given a population of more than 700,000 in Canada and 5.7 million in the U.S. Given today's technological advancements, with little alteration, a similar study could be created and distributed online, medically administered early after diagnosis, and even periodically throughout disease progress, continually collecting data over a period of decades, solving problems with sample size, diversity of subjects, disease stage, and length of study. I also wonder at one technical aspect of this study. Several tasks involved what the authors called low-pass filtering of audio samples to remove syntactic information while keeping tone and pitch intact. One task involved electronically altering pitch. Having worked with audio electronically, I can say that doing so is often not a simple matter. While any of us can download audio software with powerful tools, effectively using those tools takes training and experience. The closest concept I can compare this to is bad photoshopping. We've all seen poorly altered photographs, and many of us can identify photo alterations done by someone with mediocre to decent skill. It's a rare expert who can blend shadow and tone seamlessly in a photograph. Altering audio is similar. In fact, doing it well takes expertise, and some people make a good living in this field. Remember when we went through Task 5 and I failed to play an audio sample? I'm about to show you why. In Task 5, the authors electronically adjusted the pitch of a statement to make it sound like a question, and they altered a question to make it sound like a statement. Let's listen to what happens when you do that. Here is a recorded question.
You want me to drive through that?
Now here's that same recording, where I lowered the pitch to sound like a statement.
You want me to drive through that?
Here it is again.
You want me to drive through that?
Not quite right, is it? It's the audio equivalent of bad photoshopping. While I'm no expert, I argue that the subtle intricacies of the human voice and how we use prosody make such electronic conversions impossible for the layman or even someone with mediocre to decent skill. It would take an audio engineering professional to convert questions to statements or vice versa that you and I couldn't immediately identify as sounding wrong. We might not be able to articulate exactly what's wrong, but we know it when we hear it. There are more subtle differences to changing questions to statements than adjusting the pitch. And remember, they're playing these audio samples to the elderly and to already mentally compromised Alzheimer's patients. I wonder if the authors employed an audio engineer with the skill to manipulate sound with this level of expertise. The actual recordings the authors used were not readily available, and I, for one, would like to hear them and judge for myself. But with those critiques aside, this study takes positive steps forward in helping us understand aspects of this horrible disease. It pioneered study in an aspect of Alzheimer's, adding to our knowledge of the disease, opening new paths to explore not just in Alzheimer's, but in how the human mind processes prosodic dimensions in general. To get an additional perspective, let's take a look at a similar study. Emotional prosody perception and production in dementia of the Alzheimer's type appeared in the October 2010 edition of the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research. Authors Kay Horley, Amanda Reed, and Dennis Burnham are members of the Auditory Laboratories of the University of Western Sydney in Australia. The authors looked at 6 previous studies, including the one by Taylor and colleagues. They noted that most previous studies only looked at prosody perception and not production. They also thought that procedural differences in previous studies led to inconsistent outcomes. Their test group consisted of 10 male and 10 female monolingual Australian English speakers with moderate dementia consistent with late-onset Alzheimer's. All were tested using the MMSE or another test, the Dementia Behavior Severity Rating Scale. The control group matched the 20 dementia patients in language, age, education, and gender. They kept testing time to under 20 minutes to avoid compromising the subjects and explicitly stated they would stop testing if a subject experienced psychological distress. Participants were asked to complete 2 tasks, one perceptual and the other production. In the perceptual tasks, they used studio-recorded stimuli read aloud by an actor, and participants had to identify each recording as happy, angry, sad, or surprised. For the production task, participants listened to a recorded sentence, then were asked to repeat the sentence using the same tone of voice they heard. They were also asked to read a set of 8 simple sentences, applying either happy, angry, sad, or surprised tone of voice. As expected, the authors of this second study concluded that Alzheimer's patients lagged behind the control group in perceiving and producing prosody, particularly with sadness, surprise, and happiness. They stressed that while Alzheimer's patients may have difficulty with prosody, they still feel emotion, cautioning caregivers that prosody will likely be subtle, unnoticed, and prone to misinterpretation. This concludes the presentation of Taylor and colleagues' study, Comprehension of Grammatical and Emotional Prosody is Impaired in Alzheimer's Disease. Citations and other supplemental information will appear briefly on screen. Please direct questions to the email address on screen.